This video is brought to you by Squarespace. When you think of London, you probably are picturing this, or maybe this. But what you're probably not picturing is this.
The Aylesbury has long been considered one of the most notorious estates in London, a symbol of urban decay.
What once started as a way of lifting the British working class out of slums has over time just descended into these crime-ridden, dilapidated areas.
Two boys following out behind me, and they went, "Oh, are you jumping your car?" I went, "Yes." They tried jumping me, so knocked them both out.
Aylesbury Estate in southeast London say they're living in fear after a second murder in the area within 3 months.
Southwark Council can legally insist Beverly vacates her home.
This is what I worked all my life for, to end up with a property like this.
Today we're going to tell the dark truth behind Britain's dystopian estates.
Live in environmental conditions unmatched by anything that has existed before. Thamesmead, with its own identity, but still a lively part of London, growing from the river, the changing.
The failure to provide the kind of facilities originally intended for Thamesmead has left many of those who moved here hoping for a new life both deeply disappointed and desperate to get out.
In the 1800s, Britain was going through industrialisation. After centuries of feudalism, the working class now had these weird things called rights.
I was just wondering if possibly we'd like a pay rise?
The 1834 English Poor Law, it made a very clear distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Fair enough, you know, if you have no legs or arms, okay, you're allowed to be poor. If you were just, you know, average Joey Schmoey and all your sticks are working, how dare you not become rich? The Housing of Working Class Act of 1890.
I think the government were very perturbed about people possibly uprising against the government as they were in Russia.
So what, give them good houses, keep them quiet?
Keep them happy.
This act and a series of others were passed where they had given councils the right and the responsibility to flatten slums, get rid of these shitty slums, and in place build council houses. There was one place so hellishly awful that would become the very first council estate.
It almost goes without saying that these slums were overcrowded and poorly maintained, hotbeds of crime, disease and alcoholism. The Old Nickel was among the worst of these slums.
The Old Nickel makes Luton look like Dubai. I'm talking you're surrounded by piss and poo. This place is releasing new diseases like... The rooms were just cramming in people so that landlords could charge more rent per square inch. These landlords weren't exactly incentivized to repair things. So, you know, if there's a hole in the roof and you called the landlord, he would take one look at it and say, "Ah, that sucks." 1 in 4 babies in the Old Nickel died before the age of 1. The council took a look at it and said, "Fuck it, let's flatten the place, let's start again." And they made the Boundary Estate. And if we look at the Boundary Estate today, you might notice it looks quite nice. That's because the architect, who was called Owen Fleming, he had this crazy idea where he believed that beauty and nice looking architecture was important. This place was great, but you see, there was a problem. As the slum dwellers stared on as their homes were flattened before their eyes, awaiting the keys to their new homes, they found out that the rent was double that of the slums. And so they packed their presumably empty bags and headed over to just another nearby slum. And in moved in the more affluent, deserved working class.
We were thinking in terms of a new world. The returning soldiers deserved a decent environment, and that was really the main task. And we thought that we'd been called by chance and by our place in history to create that new world.
Post-World War I, there was a slow but gradual spread of social housing. In 1912, you had the Old Oak and Wormholt. This was being built under the Homes for Heroes. So basically, war veterans were promised to come back to land. That promise was a lie, and because they didn't want a revolution on their hands, they built this place and said, all right, fine. A bit later after this, you'd have the Beacon Tree Estate, and they actually built 27,000 homes here. This place was a fucking utopia. Imagine, you have just come from living in a literal slum, and now You have grass, you have a garden in the front and the back of your house. You had rooms big enough that you could like do that with your arms. Running water, a toilet, windows, a boiler, affordable rent. However, all of this was not gonna come without a few rules.
Every house got a handbook with rules and advice.
Among the rules, they had to clean their windows once a week. And when it came to lavatory cisterns, they were told there is no need to pull the chain with a jerk.
The idea of parental conservatism was an interesting one. It was like a socialist attitude combined with conservatism. They still believed that the aristocrats were more morally superior and better than the poor, but they had a responsibility to raise the poor up, you know, offer them a hand. Baz, put down the cigarettes and pick up a croquet stick. The people that moved into the Beacon Tree estate were given a handbook of rules. You couldn't just have a disused caravan in your driveway with like a broken washing machine out there. The idea of having standards, it wasn't a terrible one, it was fair. But they often went a bit too far, you know, there was definitely this kind of moral superiority. It led to things like they wouldn't make a pub in this area. They had to be sober in order to live in this property. But regardless of a few less beers with the boys, this was a massive upgrade from living in a slum. I mean, come on.
But most of all, Becontree gave thousands and thousands and thousands of people from the East End and beyond a home. And I think for that alone, we should salute it.
However, slowly, things would begin to change. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. They are the #1 platform for building and developing your very own beautiful website. You can now have your own completely personalized website with their new guided design system, where you choose from a professionally created layout and different styling options, and it's completely unique and customized to what you want. And with the optimized SEO tools, you're going to appear for more people and more search results, helping you grow. As well, they have flexible payments. They take so many different options: PayPal, Apple Pay. In certain countries, you can do buy now, pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. And they've got Squarespace AI, where you can do like your product descriptions and written content on a website. You can focus on just making your product really good, and Squarespace will take care of the rest. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/JimmyTheGiant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code JimmyTheGiant. Anyway, back to the video. By the 1930s, Britain's Pimp My Slum scheme was going pretty well, but then it got infected by a new dope strain of architecture called modernism. All right, we did this in the Milton Keynes video. I'm not going to do it again, but we can actually see that original modernism wasn't that bad. When we look at St. Andrew's Garden in Liverpool.
The modern and skillfully executed housing provision for the wage earners of Liverpool,
which instead of taking influence from British architecture, looked to Europe with the Horseshoe Estate Brits in Berlin. This building, okay, it's not the most beautiful, but it had brick, it had different colors, different materials, sloped roofs. It wasn't just grey concrete or like a glass fishbowl, and it was built well. Like, it stands here today in good condition and it's still used. And as I keep saying, if you were in a slum beforehand, you're not going to start questioning, oh, I'm not sure on the architectural decisions of this place. You're going to say, give me the fucking keys. We had to take a quick break from building council houses in 1939 to 1945 because Britain was busy saving the world. But following the war, these soldiers came back to a country where nearly 500,000 of the homes had been destroyed by bombs. And so the boys had to quickly hop on the tools and just start throwing up some buildings. In 1946, we got Churchill Gardens. And you might take a look at this and think, Jesus Christ, what the hell happened? We went insane building. It was like a Fortnite World Cup final. And we weren't just creating new houses, we were now creating new entire towns. And all of this was built off of these crazy radical ideas of urban planning by people like Le Corbusier and Adolf Loos.
To think about brutalism is to think about concrete.
Brutalism. All right, brutalism. So brutalism was like a reaction to modernism, whereby, from what I understand, Le Corbusier, as he got older, looked back at his original modernist buildings and said, I need to start making buildings that make you feel something. And so he created brutalism, which was just raw, rough, concrete. And yeah, they made you feel something. Depressed.
This is Dennis Lasdun's National Theatre, completed in 1976. Prince Charles thought it looked like a nuclear power station. What Charles meant was that it was an industrial-looking building, something that was rather bleak and uncompromising, something that didn't look like a theatre. But that was the point.
I don't know who designs them. I don't know who they design them for, or if they think that we feel or think any differently than they do. There must be reasons why these architects build these flats in this design and in this hard, barrack-looking way, because I'm sure they couldn't possibly like the structure and the outlook of them themselves. I don't think there was an awful lot of thought put into it. If they would have only consulted ordinary people who have to live in these places, what we would like.
Many of the modernists are a reaction of the horrors of World War I and World War II, where they specifically wanted to depart from European tradition. And so within this movement, a mood of negativity towards the past and an optimism towards the future grew. But look, all that kind of artsy-fartsy talk aside, ultimately we made them because they're cheap as chips to produce.
If all goes according to plan, by the middle of the 1980s, this village will have become a part of the largest new town ever built in Britain.
I think it's ridiculous.
This is a good farming ground. Why don't they go somewhere else where there isn't no farming ground, not far away?
The British people of the 50s and 60s were starting to get a little bit pissed that they were building entire towns in their garden, and so there was a push to come up with newer ways of creating houses but not encroaching on green space. And so in Essex Harlow, a brand new building was made that would change everything: the lawn. This building marked the beginning of the high-rise gold rush.
Post-war, though, the real trend was to replace slums and bond houses with high-density flats.
By 1975, 440,000 new high-rise apartment flats had been created. And that's because the government was subsidising every single extra floor to a building, so the incentive was built into the sky. And so this led us to some absolute beauties like Robin Hood estates.
It should be blown up.
They made a point. 15, 20 years ago, it was voted by Nationwide as the worst design block in England.
Churchill Gardens, Chalk Hill Estate.
Chalk Hill's been a problem since it was built in 1966. One of the biggest estates in London, it's always suffered more than its fair share of hooliganism, vandalism and muggings.
Haygate Estate. Look, when we look at them now, they look awful. They're completely run down, look terrible. But bearing in mind, the people that moved into this a week prior were living in a slum having rats nibbling at their toes. Now, they had fridge freezers, they had parks. They were safe. They weren't living in a biohazard anymore. This era, post-war, gave the working class a massive step up out of poverty. In 1979, 42% of British people lived in council houses. These estates, when they were first built, were loved. People loved them. There was a sense of community there. You know, they would look out for one another, and there was a pride in where they came from.
He'd never move off here. He always said, no, we've got everything. Hot water, eating. What more can a working man want?
As far as that close proximity to living is concerned, in general, I think it's an example to the country.
So what the fuck happened?
Among the 5,500 people on the Ferrier estate at Kidbrooke are 20 children living in a twilight world in the underground car parks. Youth workers discovered them sleeping rough, most of them abandoned by their families.
UK began as a small group of teenagers writing graffiti. They've now progressed to street robbery and even more violent offences.
Yeah, there's been stabbings, people being sent away for stabbings down New Malden High Street.
On the Aylesbury estate in southeast London say they're living in fear after a second murder in the area within 3 months.
My friend is dead, yeah, and this is what we're doing to support him, yeah, and look what they're doing. Look.
There's been a lot of knife crime. I've had 3 murders in the last couple of weeks.
So how many people rob you?
Originally, council housing was not associated in any way with crime. And in fact, I read this really good study that I'll link below that talks about the decline in social housing and how they became more criminal over time. And it all seems to point to a very pivotal time of change, which was the 70s. The 70s in Britain was a mad one. It was a time of high unemployment. There was mass inflation, social unrest. There were power outages happening. And so this is the backdrop of the 70s. Crime is going up. It's not looking good. And there is one law that is often pointed to as the start of the downfall of social housing, and that was the 1977 Housing Homeless Persons Act. What this did was change social housing from being like a carrot on the stick for the motivated working class to now being a right for the most vulnerable people of society.
And the homeless became the priority. And this idea of housing based on need was open to all sorts of interpretation and abuse.
Now look, this all sounds well and good. It sounds good to look after the homeless people, of course, but it did lead to some problems. If we kind of think about the incentive structure that is in play here, beforehand it was effectively a way of motivating the working class to work hard. They would get a property, they would then have pride in that property because they earned it, they deserved it, and they would take care of it and look after it. But I think the more ideological side of the Labour MPs of that time, who funnily enough were not the ones living in council estates, they saw this incentive structure as discriminatory. Why should only the good working class get a nice house? What if good doesn't even exist, bro?
People say it's the kids that break everything, it's the kids that make a mess, but I tell you it's not. When I first moved here, every day for 3 weeks I cleaned out the chutes, I cleaned out everything. Not 5 minutes later, some dirty person will come along and drop pill, everything, dirty STs, everything you can think of on the floor. It's not the kids, it's some of the peoples. They come from slums and they're going to make this a slum.
So just imagine this whole community of similarly minded working class people, motivated, they work in the same factories, they send their kids to the same school, they have a tight-knit community. But now you could just jump to the front of the queue of the housing list if you were homeless, unemployed. Those people could be the types of people that have serious mental health conditions, drug addiction problems, etc. But instead of making specific programs to take care of the homeless of society, you know, help them, train them to get into jobs, etc. But now they were just being put into these communities, and what's more is prioritized over working class people. And this started to create a bitter feeling in the general public.
Worse still, Thamesmead became a dumping ground for poor or difficult families. Today, 2 out of 3 are on housing benefit. Half the adults are unemployed.
Thamesmead did become a dumping ground. That's half its problem. They basically just threw the doors open for the first 5 or 6 years, just to get anyone onto Thamesmead. But as the years went on, people saw Thamesmead more as a prison and began to resent the areas and lost interest in all facilities and stopped trying.
I've got a quote here from 1977 of Sir Robin Wales, who was the mayor of Newham in East London. He says that if you walk in and say, I'm homeless, you get a greater priority than if you walk in and say, I've managed to do something for myself, but I'm still looking for a council property. In 1979, 57,200 people said they were homeless, and this peaked at 151,720 by 1991. And so just bear all of this in mind and consider that in the 70s as well, there was a general rise in crime, in alcoholism, drug use, and all of this was likely happening in this era as a reaction to the economic instabilities, plus the cuts to social housing and benefits that were already starting to happen in the 70s, plus this rise in low-quality high-rise flats, where tons of them had been poorly built and there was disasters and some of them were demolished.
In Birkenhead, these 2 blocks have lasted just 18 years. Now they're going to be demolished because they're literally rotten.
And because of the economic climate, the councils had to cut funding to maintain these areas, keep them looking nice. And so for the council house, it wasn't looking very good. And then it would receive its final killing blow in 1979.
Now that the election is over, may we get together and strive to serve and strengthen the country of which we're so proud to be a part.
Big Mama Thatch came in 1979 to, you know, fix all of England's problems. But it would be the Housing Act of 1980 that would introduce the idea of right to buy.
Through a policy of purchasing council houses by their tenants, a policy which was bitterly opposed by the Labour Party, a policy from which many people have profited and are very grateful for that.
It basically gave people who lived in council houses the opportunity for the first time in their lives where they could actually buy the property off of the council. And what's more, it was at a massively reduced rate. This sounded very good.
You know, some people look down on you, you know. Oh, you live in a council house, and that's not good. But when you own your own property, you do go up in the world a little bit.
Working class people now had an opportunity to get on the housing ladder. Only 55% of the population in the 1980s owned their own home, but by 1987, now 64% did. These council houses were selling to the private individuals like hotcakes. But let's jump forward a lot of years to 2015 and 2016, where home ownership has declined from its high in 2003 of 70.9% back down to 62.5%, the lowest level since 1985. So, you know, if this was intended to to bring Baz and Stacey up from the working class into the home-owning middle class, then where did all these houses go? Baz and Stace saw that their house prices had risen amazingly. It was great, and so they obviously sold their house to go live in the Cotswold and live out the Jeremy Clarkson dream. Don't get me wrong, I completely understand it. I would do 100% the same thing. But you have to start wondering, who bought these houses? Well, it turns out that it's mainly massive, wealthy investment firms who buy the house off of this middle class and then rent it back to the working class.
If we want to know what economy without property-owning middle classes look like, it's really easy to see that because the world is full of them. You can go to Brazil, you can go to South Africa, you can go to Russia, you can go to India, and you can see what economies look like when you do not have a property-owning middle class.
Charles Goh, who was the son of Miss Thatcher's housing minister, Ian Goh, he had bought 40 of the 120 council flats in one social housing project called Roehampton. So really what I'm trying to fucking illustrate in a smart way is these social houses that were funded by the taxpayer, so you know, taxes that we all paid, to build houses to help the working class, which it did for a short period of time, but it ended up, if you fast forward to the end of the movie, they just landed in the hands of the ultra wealthy and shrunk the home-owning middle class.
If you don't have a middle class society, you have a rich and poor society. And if you don't have a middle class society, you don't need middle class housing. What you need is rich housing and poor housing. And increasingly, that is what we will see.
And so, for the social housing that did remain in the hands of the council, yeah, it definitely didn't age well. In this study, it shows that the buildings that were built with better quality, with more traditional architecture, they, surprisingly, turned out to be the most popular and more people bought them. But if you were unfortunately put into one of them thrown up shitty high-rises, no one really wanted to buy them. And so this led to a phenomena, this general trend that started to happen to the social fabric of council houses that is known as residualization.
Tower blocks soared, but few predicted the squalor of so-called sink estates.
Its graffiti-covered walls, its dark alleyways, its stinking staircases, today are monuments to the decline it's suffered since then.
In the same study, it notes that not all council estates were seen as equally good. If the council thought that you were maybe one of the less deserving of the people wanting to get a council house, they would often be put into the shitter estates, creating these estates full of what we could call naughty Nigels. And so along with this change to social credit that now incentivized people to be homeless, not to work, you would even get more money for the more kids you had. If you weren't married, you'd get more money. Some people even point to the introduction of school league tables in 1992, leading to a rise in kids being expelled from school in order to make it look like your school's performance was better. These kids who are probably, you know, maybe they struggled in school, etc., they would often be now just living on their council estate kids, you know, kicking over bins and graffitiing because they have nothing to do all day. And it's believed that this is actually what created the underclass that we later now call chavs, or really we call roadmen.
The gang in and around the local shops intimidates many of the residents.
I don't go around there. It's not safe to go around there. The kids hang around outside the pub and they aggravate other people that go around there. They deliberately cause upset around there.
Just imagine you're like, you know, you're a hard-working class bloke. You're happy to spend all day earning your crust. Get home, have a beer, give your missus a kiss, go to bed, do it all again. You probably don't want to live next door to Crazy Steve's who's smoking bifters out the window, listening to 50 Cent at 3 PM on a Wednesday.
Hey, bruv, shut your mouth.
Sorry, mate, sorry. This process moved the more working class people out of these estates, and so that left all of the naughty kids to be put into one classroom together with very little assistance to try and raise them out into jobs, etc. And surprisingly, that created problems.
This video describes the life of a gang which associates itself with the estate. Teenagers rapping promises of violence towards rival groups in other areas.
It's been sold as the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance for families from humble beginnings to get themselves a secure footing on the London property ladder. But actually, the right to buy your council home may not be such a great deal.
Hard. I actually worked 2 jobs to earn the money to put the deposit down. I literally worked from 9 till 5 and then 6 until midnight. And I was really happy that I was able to buy my own home.
But 5 years ago, Beverly received a letter from Southwark Council revealing that all she had worked for, her home, was going to be bulldozed.
I'm going to be moved out due to my local council regenerating the estate and basically taking our homes under compulsory purchase.
Compulsory purchase is a medieval law that was designed to give the crown the right to flatten your house if they needed to build a railway or like an army barracks. So under compulsory purchase, the council can knock on your door, say, look mate, we need your house, here's £20, and you have to get the fuck out. I'm exaggerating, but they could literally offer half the market value, it seemed, because they had to give you a price that they deemed was fair. And it led to like this mafioso extortion that is completely legal. And there are many examples of this, but we'll focus on one in particular, the Haygate estate.
Residents who were moved off the Haygate estate in South London under a huge regeneration scheme have claimed they weren't offered enough money to buy another home locally.
Haygate was a shithole. I know that because I used to go there to do parkour, and genuinely I was scared for my life. But they were good jumps, so you know, sometimes you just have to risk it. From the late 90s to the early 2000s, there was plans to redevelop this place. And although most of it was now boarded up and completely derelict, there were still some people who remained. And for the council, that was inconvenient. And so they had to evict them. But in order to evict them, they had to buy their property. Some of the offers for the property in London were £80,000. Bearing in mind, in the 2000s, a property the similar size and the similar area would have been worth about £300,000. So if the council is kicking you out of your house and giving you £80,000, where do you go? You can't now move down the road. You have to leave London, your community where you grew up. Where back in the 80s, you were promised this was a fantastic investment, my friend, buy the place, only to find years later the place is worth nothing. And now we're going to flatten it, make luxury apartments that are going to be sold from the lowest price of £550,000. Thank you very much. But it turned out in 2017 that 100% of the flats that were sold at the time were sold to private investment firms. But look, surely at the end of the day, this means more money in the council's pocket that they can give to people and help, right? Southwark Council sold this land to a private development firm from Australia called Landlease for a whopping total of £50 million, after having spent £44 million on emptying it, where it's predicted for Landlease, it has a gross development value of £990 million. There's actually other reports out there that claim that Southwark Estate sold the land at a loss, and it all just seems a bit fishy to me.
You had a right to buy, but the money that was taken from what you bought with was going to build other houses, other council houses.
That's right, yeah.
Which never happened.
It's sad to see it, but social housing really fell from grace. And there's no more vivid a moment than on the 14th of June 2017, where a fire broke out on a high-rise flat called Grenfell Towers. And in its glory days, in that period, Britain experienced the biggest economic boom it had ever seen up until that point, raising people out of slums to working class and then to middle class, if only for a brief moment. And to me, I can't help but see it that the country just opted for short-term profit. We sold the family silver, and instead of reinvesting the money into the working class to raise everyone's standard of living, we have what we have now. And I'm telling you, Britain is getting depressing. I don't think there's anyone these days that can deny the obvious evidence that there is a shrinking middle class, that towns are dying and places just look kind of shit here now.
Once the rich get richer, they buy more assets from the middle class. Middle class gets poorer, which means that the rate of inequality increases more, because the middle class has less assets and the rich has more assets. So we know things will get worse, and ultimately at the end of the day, the speed at which life is getting worse now, people are not going to accept it.
It's sad to see, and I hope that we fix it. I want to know your stories around council housing and your thoughts, so comment below. If you want a further discussion on this topic, come join us on our Discord, I'll link that. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.